Warcraft lore had many character archetypes and classes over its long history, and some of them are simpler than others, while some get extremely specific. I mean, have you seen anything even remotely close to demon hunters anywhere else? Fighting fire with fire? Okay, that happens. A dark, brooding warrior. Okay, I'll give you that. Magical tattoos. I've seen it before. Using your inner demons or consuming a demonic power for good. Sure, that's great. A blind person who somehow sees better than an able-bodied person. Some of my favorite shows had them. But put them all together in one character, and it's not just one character, but there's about a bajillion of them running around being edgy. These things are what really makes Warcraft so unique. Which is all the weirder that they can't seem to conceive of multiple classes with bows or guns, but that's beside the point. But in the midst of all those very unique concepts, there are some very basic archetypal character concepts that are also needed to make the universe keep going. These are all your paladins and priests and warlocks whose job description is fairly simple. The guy who prays, the guy who would literally stump you with a Bible, the guy who sold his soul to the devil for extra 3 inches below the belt and maybe some magic spells. And amidst all those basic concepts is one concept that is already canon and present in the lore and in the setting, and I promise you, you met characters of this class in World of Warcraft, and not infrequently, but still, after 21 years, we cannot play one. And that class is, of course, the Necromancer. I don't think I need to introduce the class concept, really. If this is somehow your first encounter with Warcraft lore, first off, go watch Noble or something first. But let me then describe to you the brief history of the Necromancer. The first necromancers we meet in the lore are called necrolytes, and as the students of Gul'dan, they are a mix of a warlock and a necromancer. Their primary source of power is demons and fell magic, and they use many spells we now associate with the warlocks. However, they also use some spells warlocks do not, and are more closely associated with the necromantic side. Spells like Death Coil or, of course, Raise the Dead. These necrolytes raised armies of the dead to throw against their enemies. And of course, Gul'dan himself raised the souls of his fallen necrolytes into the bodies of the Knights of Stormwind, creating the first Death Knights, far more resembling warlocks themselves than the paladins the later Death Knights would resemble. Perhaps partially because of these multiclassers, you often hear that we don't need necromancers because we already have warlocks. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Necromancers return to the spotlight in a major way decades later in universe, when the Third War begins with the Plague of Lordaeron and necromancers of the Cult of the Damned are spreading the plague. This is really the point where they get much of their unique identity. They don't just raise the dead, they create some very specific new forms of undeath, sewing corpses together to create abominations, or creating banshees out of fallen elven mages, or creating all other kinds of horrific creatures, and most importantly spreading plagues and diseases. These necromancers aren't just evil, selfish people, they are religious in their devotion to the Scourge, best exemplified in Kel'Thuzad, who is oddly cordial to Arthas as they mow down Quel'Thalas and Lordaeron together, all in order to backstab the Burning Legion and free their master, the Lich King. These days you do not see a lot of them, except when something related to the Scourge comes up, such as, for example, the poor man's copy of the Scourge and Maldraxxus, or those weird bearded people in the Maw, who don't think they were ever explained what they are besides Mawsworn. The rest of the Mawsworn look like animated armor, and I don't know what's up with these guys. All this says, though, is that we had multiple perfect opportunities to see the Necromancer class added to World of Warcraft, and those opportunities have been squandered. We didn't get our Necromancers in Vanilla. In Wrath of the Lich King we got Death Knights, which is fine enough. And next time Undeath returns as the major element is Shadowlands, which I think wasted opportunity describes best as a whole. Now I have to ask if we will ever have another opportunity to introduce Necromancers as a playable class, but we did have good opportunities for that in the past. I can already hear two big arguments often used against Necromancers as a playable class. Very weak arguments, which you often hear nonetheless. Well, we don't need Necromancers because we already have Death Knights. Well, by that logic, we don't need priests, because we already have paladins. We don't need hunters or rogues, because we already have warriors. Well, we do, of course, because those are two very different classes with very different playstyles. And sure, Death Knights do a little bit of necromancy, but so do paladins do a little bit of healing. Necromancer is focused on being the necromancer, instead of a small addition to the more versatile kit. The second of those arguments is very similar. We don't need necromancers because we already have warlocks. And sure, there is some similarity between the concepts and that lore origin of necrolytes, but hunters also do pets and summoning, but they are doing it very differently. A true necromancer would also play their summoning very differently from the warlock. And I am here today to tell you exactly how a necromancer could play differently from both Death Knight and warlock. My necromancer is a cloth-wearing caster who can perform DPS and healing, preferring staves, polearms, or daggers and maces and offhands. Cloth seems pretty obvious, as that's what you see most necromancers wearing, and we haven't seen a cloth class in WoW in ages. The weapon choices are also probably nothing revolutionary. I have toyed with the idea of them using leather, firstly to give them a more unique identity from other casters, and secondly to give them a little more survivability for reasons you will soon see. But in the end, we already have so many leather classes. The Necromancer's secondary resource besides mana is the soul shards. If you really have to call it something unique, call it something like a death essence, a necrotic essence, bone dust, whatever. WoW, at least these days, tries to make every class call their resource something unique, even when it's not. In the end, that is what the resource is. Soul shards. As they attack and kill enemies, they gather shards of their souls to empower their abilities. Now here comes the part about how the necromancer's summoning is unique compared to hunters and warlocks. Necromancers do not normally have a permanent pet, maybe with some very specific talent in one spec's tree. When they start combat, they can cast a spell to summon a swarm of brittle skeletons which do damage and distract their enemies from the caster. Much like Death Knight's Corpse Explosion or the Demonology Warlock's Implosion, they can also blow those up to deal the damage instantly. But as the Necromancer's minions deal damage, and they themselves cast many dots and debuffs in the form of diseases and curses, and the caster gains his soul shards from those actions, they can spend those soul shards on summoning something bigger. For example, summon a small pack of ghouls, or an abomination, or a blade-storming bone golem. All of these summons are normally temporary. Perhaps they can be extended with talents and spells and spending more soul shards, but they're not normally supposed to be permanent pets. The power of the Scourge lies in its numbers, and the Necromancer's playstyle should encapsulate that. This isn't even the most fun part of the Necromancer's summoning kit. Remember, the core idea of the Necromancer is that they raise their enemies from the dead. So when you gather enough soul shards or get some proc or large cooldown ability, you can use it to actually raise the dead enemy as your temporary pet, and not as a ghoul or an abomination or a banshee. Now, they retain most of their abilities and their own unique model, perhaps with a filter to signify they're undead now. but now they fight for you and fight their former friends. Ever played a necromancer in the Diablo games? Do you know how fun it is to have a whole swarm of not just skeletons but the actual enemies you killed running around the field killing everything? Of course, in an MMO it would need to be properly balanced so your swarm of risen mobs doesn't just obliterate everything. That is a part of game design that comes later with the actual engine, the balancing and the fine-tuning. The core idea is to have fun watching and directing your former enemies against their friends. Like any class in World of Warcraft, Necromancer has 3 specializations. I call them Blood, Bone, and Flesh. To start with Bone, this is the Necromancer that specializes in summoning, giving you longer summon duration, cheaper raise dead, or more skeletons to summon. Perhaps this is the Necromancer that has some underpowered talent to keep one summon as permanent if you really want that style. Flesh is the Necromancer that specializes in diseases, spreading dots and debuffs with their abilities, making their diseases more infectious as mobs get close to each other. And I kept Blood for last because this is the most unique one, in that it's the healer specialization. Blood necromancers drain the health of the enemies and funnel it into their pets or their allies, as well as keeping a blood pool from their damage dealt or life up style self-damage that they can add to their healing if low on other resources. Much like all the other classes since the War Within, they have their own hero talents, of course. Bone and Flesh necromancers can choose the Plague Spreader hero talent, who is built around the Plague Carrier ability. You can now cast dots and debuffs on your summons, and as those things tick on your pets, they spread those diseases to the nearby enemies. By carefully directing summons around, you can really get those AoEs ticking and gathering huge swarms of enemies to take down at once. Blood and Flesh necromancers can choose the Harvester of Dread hero talent, patterned after the Venthyr, which focuses on crowd control, subverting immunities to disease or CC in enemies, or gathering more resource as you inflict those debilitating effects. And finally, Blood and Bone necromancers can choose the Lich hero talent. The Lich gets a shape-shifting form button where they can turn into a skeletal version of themselves and gain extra survivability, either by placing a phylactery somewhere to respawn from even in combat, or by replacing one of their minions to rise again. It might seem odd for a class who doesn't do tanking, but remember that Blood necromancers can tap into their own life to heal others, and Bone can use the same to empower their minions. And of course, turning into a Lich is just really a cool ability to have. The only major question left is the accessibility of the class. Lore-wise, why do necromancers join us? Why the accepted now? Well, with the Illidari and the Ebonblade becoming somewhat accepted, the Ebonblade could simply recruit some cult of the damned members who seek redemption and want to use the power they learned against their former masters. Yes, it is going to be difficult in the future without major undead-related threats, but it could have definitely happened in the Shadowlands, if it wasn't what it was. As for which races could be necromancers, I imagine it could be available to most races, because most of them had some encounters with the Scourge, and Cult of the Damned wasn't picky with their recruits. But definitely, at the very least, it could be 4. Humans, dwarves, gnomes, Draenei, if you remember the Orkney, Worgen, from Shadowpunk Keep, for example, orcs, trolls, undead, of course, blood elves, goblins, void elves, Nightborn, which is a little bit odd, but for the parity's sakes it fits their style enough, Dark Irons, Zandalari trolls, Cool Tyrants, because really they're just big humans, Vulpira, because waste not, want not, and maybe even Drakthir, because Neltharion did do some undead experiments. And that, ladies and gentlemen, mostly gentlemen, I have seen the YouTube analytics, is my concept of what the Necromancer should have been. Will we ever get the chance to introduce Necromancers again? It seems unlikely at this moment. In the next expansion after midnight we do return to Northrend, so we might see something happening with the Scourge, but I will not bet on getting Necromancers out of it. I'd love it if it eventually happened, but even if it does, it might be another decade before we get this lore-rich class. Instead, we get Evokers, which I don't hate, but they would not have been my first choice, especially how narrow the concept became instead of becoming Warcraft sorcerer. Well, let's focus on the positive. Would you have done Necromancers differently? Do you think Necromancers are a stupid idea and shouldn't be a class? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe, and maybe visit the coffee page in the video description below if you value my designs and you too wish we could have seen that in WoW. Meanwhile, that will be all for this video, and I hope to see you next time.